TDD last time, and we even got into a little bit of an example, and real soon you're going to be writing your own test cases. So we're going to get through most of the material today that is really about the part about writing test cases that most people don't learn when they first learn about testing. And because they don't learn about these things, they come to think of testing as this unpleasant, horrible thing to do that you can, there's kind of a no-win situation. So we're going to talk about mocks and stubs, which really, when I really got comfortable with using them, it's sort of the scales fell from my eyes in terms of how to do effective testing. And we're going to go back to the example that we've been working on so far, where we were talking about this controller method that was going to look up stuff in the remote database. This is for our Rotten Potatoes app. And we had gotten as far as looking at the two specs that said that it should call a method in the model that's going to do the actual work. We got as far as a spec that will make sure that we're choosing the right template to render when this is done. And the last, remember, we wrote down 3 things that this controller method had to do. The third thing, which we haven't done yet, is that it should, if it gets search results from the model method, it should make those results available to the template. Now, as a preview, we already know that the way that we make stuff available to a template from within a controller method is that we set instance variables in the controller method, right? And then those instance variables can be used in the view. So in order to do this one, you're thinking, well, OK, then what we really want to check, because you're a step ahead of me, is we want to make sure that assuming the model method returns the right thing, that we make that information that came from the model correctly available to the view. And if you're thinking a step ahead of me, which I hope you are, that means we got to make sure that the controller method is setting up instance variables with values that can be then picked up by the view. Now notice I said assuming the model method does the right thing. One of the things that we said last time, and I'm going to keep repeating over and over again because it's so important, is each test really is there to test one thing. We already know that we're going to have to do some tests for the model method separately. So for now, we're stubbing out the behavior of the model, and we're going to assume that it does the right thing. We're going to let it do the right thing in a controlled way because we want to focus on the controller method. So to test this idea that it makes the results available to the template, we're going to look at another addition to RSpec. Remember I said that RSpec is a basic testing framework, but it also comes with some plugins so that if you're specifically writing Rails apps, there are some kinds of things you'd like to be able to test. And RSpec comes with sort of additional macros or libraries that let you do that. And we're going to look at one called assigns, which basically allows you to pass a symbol that names a controller instance variable and shows and returns what that variable would be if the view tried to look at it. So basically, assigns gives you the view's idea of what some value of an instance variable is. Now, of course, in our current code, we were doing such a simple test case that we didn't even set up the instance variables yet. And let's remind ourselves what this looked like. So this is the method that we've been using so far. And remember, this does the simplest thing possible to make the specs pass that we've done up to this point. We haven't yet done the spec to check that the controller method is setting up an instance variable that the view can use. In fact, it's not setting up any instance variables at all. So that's problematic. Again, let's go back to the idea of the code we wish we had. Well, first of all, what would the instance variable look like? We said assuming the model method does its job and returns the right thing. Well, what would the right thing be in terms of the happy path? Presumably, it would be a list of something that looks like a list of movie objects, right? We already have a class to represent what movies are. So here's an example of what we might want the code to look like. OK, so let's see what's going on here. I'm setting up some fake results. And what's a mock? A mock is an object that pretends to be of this class. In other words, if you ask it, what are you? It'll say, I'm a movie. But it doesn't actually have any behaviors. It's like a stupid stunt double that can only do a specific small repertoire of tasks. It can't do what the real actor does. So, by the way, no diss on stunt doubles. They do amazing work. Just saying. So what am I doing here? I'm basically creating the results that I think would come back from the movie method if it existed. And now I'm going to stub the class method find in TMDB and return these fake results. Right? So what am I doing? Again, I'm setting up conditions so that under the controlled environment of the test, this movie method, which we haven't yet written, can return a canned result that's consistent with it working properly, because that isn't the thing we're testing. We need that information to do the thing we're really testing, which is what we're looking for now. Right? Now we're going to go ahead and post to trigger the controller method. We already saw this in the previous test. So this is going to cause the controller action to run. Only now what we're looking at is to see if the view tried to dereference an instance variable called movies, we would like it to get the value that we set up as the movie stub. So think of what the flow that's going on here. Right? We're going to call the controller method. Controller method is going to call the model method, which doesn't exist, but that's OK because we have stubbed it. What's the stub going to return? It's going to return these fake results. So we have completely faked out the behavior that's not essential to this test. Because what we really want to check is, given that this result comes back, can we make it available to the view? So that's what assigns does. It gives us the view's idea of what the instance variable will be set to. And that's how we fake out the parts of the test that we didn't want to control. So this really now we have a couple of different concepts about seams. Remember, we said a seam is a place where you can change the behavior of your program without changing the source code in that place. And it's particularly useful for testing because that's exactly what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to, in a controlled way, exercise little bits of the program without making changes to the other parts of the program on which they depend. So in that example, we saw two different kinds of seams. We saw a stub, which is similar to what we saw last time. Last time we saw should receive, which says should receive means if I don't get a method call on this object, then that was an error. That should have happened. Stub is a little bit looser. It says you might get a method call on this object, and if you do, here's what instructions you should follow. But it doesn't cause an error for there not to be one. A mock is a stunt double of an object, and you often use it for behavior verification. In other words, in this case, we want to verify the behavior of this other thing. It needs a movie or a list of movie results to interact with, but we don't want to go to the effort necessarily of creating the real movie objects because we're not actually going to do anything to them, right? In this limited case, the only thing the movie objects are going to do is play the role of a result that we're returning in a canned manner. And having said that, we can, for example, stub individual methods on it. So for example, suppose we're testing a controller action where we know that when a movie result, let's say, comes back from the movie model, it's going to take a look at the title attribute, for instance. In that case, we could do something like this, where we're creating a mock or a double of a movie object, and we're saying, if anybody calls the title method on you, just return this. So again, it's sort of, you can a very small number of behaviors so that you can use the object in very limited circumstances. If you look at the documentation for the latest RSpec, which I think is 2.14, they are now deprecating the terms stub and mock in favor of a single term, double. And the idea is that it's called a test double, like a stunt double. It's a stand-in that is not really the real object, but can do part of the job of the real object in a test. And as it turns out, internally, the way that stubs and mocks are implemented are similar enough that it makes sense to use a single term. However, I will personally tell you that I find it useful to mentally keep a difference between the two things. A mock plays a role that, like, look, we need an object, we need a warm body to stand in, and it needs to be able to do one or two specific things. A stub is more like, this method might be called, and since we don't want to deal with having the real method interact here, we will provide a canned response. So the semantics are subtly different. One of them is more of a convenience of like ignore the rest of the app. The other one is more, I'm going to set up some expectations because I need for this object to do a certain number of things. So in each case, though, the idea is that the seam enables just enough functionality to pass the specific behavior in that one test. So let's kind of put these things together, looking at both this spec and the two that we looked at last time. If we think of what does it mean to write a good spec or a good test case, well, first of all, it should test just one behavior. And that's really extreme, right? If, even in our simple controller method, we saw that calling the model method, passing the right thing to the model method, and making the right thing available from the result of the model method, that's actually 3 different behaviors, and we wrote 3 different specs for them. Figure out what seams you're going to need to isolate the behaviors you want to test from other behaviors that they rely on but that aren't part of the test, and therefore what kinds of expectations are appropriate to use. You could use stubs if you're not sure about the number of times something will be called, and if the fact that you're calling it is not necessarily essential to the test. You could use expectations like should receive if you want to set up a method and make sure that it actually gets called, or should not receive if you want to make sure that something doesn't get called. For example, you might be testing that if the customer didn't agree to the terms of sale, the charge my credit card method should not be called. That's a perfectly legitimate code path. Once you've set up your before conditions, you've set up your seams, make sure that your test fails for the correct reason. In other words, the reason you want it to fail is you have correctly expressed what the code ought to do, but you haven't written the code yet. That's the reason for the failure. As opposed to it fails because of a syntax error, or you misspelled the name of a variable, or you stubbed the wrong thing, or you didn't realize there's something that the method expects to call and you didn't stub it, and now bad things happen. Given that it fails for the right reason, now you're on to the easy part, right? Writing code, in case you haven't figured this out yet, is actually the easy part. Determining what code to write and how to test it and where the boundaries ought to be, that's actually the harder part. So this is kind of a way of making sure that you structure the hard part of it first. And once you've got a good failing test, and as we'll see, fixing bugs is really similar, right? The hard thing about fixing a bug is finding it and reproducing it. And if you can do that in a test, once you've done that, backfilling the code to fix it is a lot easier. And once you've got the test to pass, you look for opportunities to refactor your code, look for places to make it beautiful, right? Just like writing, once you've got your rough draft down, it doesn't mean you're done. It means you sort of understand what your intentions were. Now you can actually go back and make it pretty. So we can add to the catalog of test techniques we've seen. We already saw should receive. We saw that you can optionally tell should receive what it should get, what arguments, and you can also optionally tell it what to return if that matters in your test case. We've also now seen that you can do stubs, and just like should receive, you can stub something and specify what it returns. Now you might ask, could you call stub and say with, just like you can do with should receive? Well, syntactically you can do it, but the question is whether it makes any sense, right? Because the whole point of a stub is you're communicating the intent that this is not central to the functionality I'm testing. Whereas with should receive, part of the central functionality is I want to make sure this method actually gets called. So in that case, you might imagine that you also want to make sure it gets called with the correct arguments. So you could stub something with arguments, but the fact that you're stubbing it already says, I don't actually care that much if it gets called. It's kind of there just in case. You can also create mocks, which are doubles of an object. They will behave like the class you say they are. That's what they'll claim to be. But if you try to actually call any of the class methods on them, they'll throw up their hands in despair and they won't know what to do. They're really, really dumb objects, and you can stub one at a time specific methods on them. And in a moment, we'll answer the question of what happens if you're stubbing so many methods that it turns out you ought to just be using a real object. So, oh, and we looked at assigns, which is another one of the matchers that RSpec provides that is specific to Rails, which basically says, tell me what the view would get if it tried to dereference this instance variable. And usually it's used when you want to make sure that a controller action correctly set up the value of some instance variable that the view is then going to render. So here's a question. Should receive combines a something and a something, whereas stub is only a something. You can read while I have a drink.